In England, in the early 19th century, a woman with no money and no father was not a person in any legal sense that mattered. She was a problem waiting to be assigned to someone. Philippa Crale had been assigned by a promise made in a sick room, in the last days of a man she had loved and trusted, who had apparently trusted her rather less in return to Gerald Fenwick, Viscount Merton, who had found her at the York Assembly on a Wednesday evening in November and was crossing the room toward her with the calm of a man collecting an object he has already paid for. She had two choices. She could leave with him, or she could cause a scene sufficiently spectacular that no one in the north of England would invite her anywhere again. She was calculating the cost of the second option when the crowd near the door went quiet. Not the polite quiet of music stopping, the particular quiet of a room rearranging itself around a person it did not intend to obstruct. She grabbed the nearest arm. The man it belonged to did not flinch. He did not look at her. He shifted his weight, slowly, smoothly, so that he stood between her and the direction she had come from, and he continued his conversation as though she were not there. She would learn his name in 30 seconds. She would not learn, for much longer, that she had been carrying the answer to his worst problem in a locked case she had never once thought to open. The York Assembly rooms smelled of candle wax, damp wool, and something sweeter underneath orange peel, perhaps, or cloves put out to cover the smell of too many people in too warm a space on a cold November evening. Philippa had been there for 40 minutes and had spent 37 of them near the wall beside the punch table, where the light was thinnest and the social obligation to converse was lowest. And she had been doing well until Gerald Fenwick walked in and saw her from across the room. She had 3 seconds, perhaps 4. She looked, left a cluster of matrons she did not know. She looked right the wall. She looked straight ahead, the crowd near the entrance, which was currently arranged in the particular formation of people giving way to someone they did not feel they could stand in front of. And in the center of that formation stood a man she had never seen before, very large, very still, speaking to 2 other men with the unhurried economy of someone for whom all the hurrying is done by everyone else. She did not think. She crossed the distance in 12 steps, reached out, and took his arm just above the elbow. He did not flinch. He did not look at her. He continued speaking to the 2 men, something about a road survey near Pickering that she processed through no part of her mind. And as he spoke, he shifted smoothly, without ceremony, as though adjusting for a draft, so that his shoulder came between her and the direction she had come from. It took perhaps 4 seconds. It looked like nothing. She felt her breathing begin to slow. Gerald Fenwick stopped 2 paces from them. She could see him in her side vision, a lean, fair-haired man of 32 with good boots and an expression that had not changed because he did not intend to make a scene at the York Assembly any more than she did. He stood there for a moment, calculating, and then he withdrew, not gone, but pulled back to the edge of the room, patient in the way of men who consider themselves creditors. The man whose arm she held finished his sentence. Then he turned and looked at her directly for the first time, and she understood, from the quality of the attention calm, absolute, assessing nothing. It had not already decided why the room had moved for him. His face was angular, weathered at the edges, and gave nothing away that it had not chosen to give. He had eyes the color of iron left out in the rain. He said, not quietly, but not loudly, "Shall I be your cousin?" It was not inflected as a question. Philippa said, "Yes." He turned back to the 2 men, both of whom were managing, with varying success. The expression of people pretending not to have noticed anything. "My cousin," he said, "from Derbyshire, newly arrived." He said it the way one states a fact about the weather simply, requiring no corroboration. The two men accepted it the way they would have accepted information about the weather with a nod, and a small adjustment of their own expressions toward something warmer. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, during which Philippa stood at the man's side and understood, progressively and with a sinking clarity, what she had done. The two men addressed him twice in this time, once as Your Grace, and once as Ashborne. She had grabbed a duke. Not any duke. Ashborne was a name she knew from the way one knows names. One has heard around the edges of other people's serious conversations, the kind of name that appears when people are discussing things they do not expect a woman to have opinions about, attached to a title that was reportedly solitary, reportedly capable, and reportedly not someone you approached without a specific and legitimate purpose. She had grabbed him because he was there and large, and the room moved for him. She had not, in the 15 seconds available to her, thought through the implications of the approach. She was thinking through them now. He walked her to the supper room when the conversation concluded, moving through the assembly with the particular ease of a man who has never had to negotiate a crowd. And once they were through the door and in the relative quiet of the room beyond, smaller, warmer, smelling of cold meats and candle smoke, and the residual anxiety of people taking a break from performing, he stopped and turned to her and said, "Tell me what you need." Philippa looked at him. She looked at the supper table, at the arrangement of plates she did not intend to eat from. She said, "That man, Gerald Fenwick, Viscount Merton, he believes he has a claim on me." "What kind of claim?" "The kind my father arranged without telling me." She kept her voice even. It was not difficult. She had been keeping her voice even on this subject for 2 months. "A promise made in a sick room. I was not present." He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the far end of the room, at the wall, which was where he appeared to look when he was processing information rather than asking for more. She noticed that he did not make a sympathetic face. She found this a relief she had not expected. "Is the claim legally valid?" he said. "I am not certain." She said, "My father's solicitor in Derby believes it may not be, but has not yet given me a formal opinion." She paused. "Merton does not appear to share that uncertainty." He looked back at her. "Where are you staying tonight?" "A boarding house on Stonegate." She had been in York for 4 days. Having left her father's house, which was now technically the subject of an estate settlement, she could not afford a solicitor to expedite with 1 trunk, the document case, and £11 to her name. She had not told anyone this last part. He nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. He said, "I have a house here. The housekeeper is in residence. You may stay there tonight, with full propriety and complete documentation if required." He said documentation the way one says it when one has already considered which documents would be relevant. "In the morning we will discuss what comes next." Philippa looked at him. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you grabbed my arm at the correct moment, and I prefer problems to be solved rather than deferred." She did not know what to do with this answer. She thought about the boarding house on Stonegate, about the £11, about Merton's expression as he stood 2 paces away and calculated. She thought about her father in a sick room, making promises she had not been asked to agree to, which she supposed was a thing fathers did and did not make less true for being understandable. She said, "I will need to collect my trunk." He sent his footman for it while she was still in the supper room. She did not realize he had done this until they were in his carriage and the footman returned with her trunk, and she understood then that he had already decided before she agreed. She was not certain whether to find this alarming or efficient, She filed the question alongside several others that were accumulating faster than she could answer them. The house on the north side of the city was narrow, well-kept, and smelled of cedar and cold hearth, and the kind of careful emptiness that houses acquire when they are maintained but not lived in. The housekeeper, a woman called Nance, who appeared to have been awake and expecting them, showed Philippa to a room with a fire already laid and a water jug already heated, and asked no questions, which was either extreme tact or the behavior of someone who had been told in advance what to expect. Philippa lay awake for an hour in the dark, listening to the city and thinking about the document case she had carried from her father's house, which was on the floor beside the bed, where she always kept it, which contained, among other papers, a sealed letter she had never opened, because it was addressed to someone she did not know in a hand she could not identify. She had been meaning to ask her father's solicitor about it for 2 months. She had not yet found the right moment. She touched the cord around her neck. The brass key was there, small and plain, the way it always was. In the morning, she would find out what comes next. Philippa came downstairs at 7:30 to find the Duke already at the breakfast table with a letter in his hand and no expression on his face, which she was beginning to understand was his default arrangement. Nance appeared with tea that was at the correct temperature, which Philippa drank, and bread that was warm, which she ate. And then the Duke folded his letter and said, "Merton left York last night." She set down her cup. "How do you know?" "I had someone watch the coaching in." He said it without apology. He took the northern road, toward Ashborne. Philippa looked at the table. She said, "That is where you live." "It is where I live," he said. She thought about this. She thought about Merton taking the northern road, and about the fact that the Duke of Ashbourne's estate was north of York, and about the fact that she was currently in the Duke of Ashbourne's York house discussing whether Merton had a legal claim on her father's estate. These facts formed a shape she did not yet have the full picture to see. She said, "You are going to make me an arrangement. I am going to offer you one," he said. "You are under no obligation to accept it." The arrangement was this: she would come to Ashborne Hall as a ward of the estate formally documented, legally defensible, carrying a position that Merton could not challenge without challenging the Duke of Ashbourne directly, which Merton, with his particular brand of calculated risk assessment, would not do. In exchange, she would manage the estate's still room and physic garden, which had fallen into neglect, and provide basic remedies to the tenant families, which the hired surgeon had been failing to do adequately for 2 seasons. She asked how he knew about the still room. He said Nance had mentioned, upon her arrival, that Philippa had a small case of dried herbs she kept with her trunk. She had also a formulary she had copied from her mother's, and a working knowledge of compound remedies she had been adding to since the age of 14. She had not mentioned any of this the night before. "You had me assessed," she said. "Nance assessed you," he said. "She is better at it than I am." This was either a very honest statement or a very good performance of one. She had not yet determined which. So she looked at the bread instead and ate the rest of it. And then she said, "I accept." He nodded. He returned to his letter. She poured herself a second cup of tea, and outside the York morning was cold and honest, and doing nothing to conceal what it was, which was November in the north, which is a thing that does not apologize for itself. They left York on a Thursday morning when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the road north was the kind of road that Yorkshire reserves for November, rutted, narrow, edged with bare hedgerows that offered no particular comfort, and asked for none. Philippa sat with the document case on her lap for the first hour, which was where she always put it in carriages. Not from anxiety, but from habit, It was the habit of someone who has learned that the things which matter most are the things you keep within reach. The Duke sat across from her and read. He did not attempt conversation, which she found restful in a way she had not expected to find anything restful since her father died. She looked out the window at the dark fields and the low stone walls and the occasional farmhouse sending its thin column of smoke straight up into the still air, and she thought about her mother's formulary, and about the physic garden the housekeeper had described, and about what it would mean to have work that was hers to do and a place. However, temporary, that was hers to do it in. She was not thinking about the Duke. Or rather, she was thinking about the Duke the way she thought about a locked room she had been given the key to, aware of its presence, deferring the opening. Ashborne Hall appeared first, as a roofline above a stand of bare elms, stone and slate. Large and regular, the kind of house that had been built by people who understood that the North did not reward extravagance, and had made their peace with beauty that was structural rather than decorative. The entrance hall smelled of cold stone, beeswax, and wood ash, a smell like the inside of a church that is also someone's home. Philippa stood in it for a moment and felt, against her best intentions, something ease in her chest. Nance was waiting. Not the York Nance, a different woman with the same name, or perhaps the same woman who had travelled ahead, which Philippa later established was in fact the case. Dorothea Nance had been the Ashbourne housekeeper for 22 years and kept a room in the York house for exactly this kind of occasion. She was 63, built like someone who has been making decisions since early in the morning her entire adult life. And she looked at Philippa with the expression of a woman who has been expecting something and is deciding whether what has arrived matches what she expected. She showed Philippa her rooms, a bedroom, a small sitting room, and a connecting door to the still room passage, and helped her unpack. And when Philippa set the document case on the top shelf of the wardrobe and patted the cord at her neck to confirm the key was there, Nance's hands went still for the length of a single breath, and then she resumed smoothing the counterpane and said, with perfect evenness, "There is hot water for washing whenever you want it." It was barely anything. A pause, half a second. But Philippa had spent her childhood learning to read the small movements of people in rooms where the big movements were not what was actually happening. And she looked at Nance and said nothing, and Nance said nothing, and the moment passed. She thought about it at dinner, which was the first dinner at Ashborne Hall, the three of them herself, the Duke, and Galt, the estate steward, a compact, serious man with ink on his left fingers in a dining room that smelled of roast meat and candle wax, and the very specific exhaustion of a house that is being run carefully on, not quite enough. The Duke said, "Near the end of the meal, you will want to see the still room in the morning. Galt can show you the garden." She said, "What happened to the person who managed it before?" "She retired," he said, 2 years ago." He looked at his plate. "She was ill. It was the right decision. And no one since. No one with the right knowledge." He looked up. She had the sense, again, of being assessed by someone very good at it. "We have had a surgeon from Harrogate. He is adequate for the common cases. And for the uncommon ones," Galt said, drearily, from the far end of the table. The Duke did not answer this, which was itself an answer. Philippa looked at the candle and thought about what 2 years of inadequate care looked like in a village of tenant families, and she felt the familiar pull of a problem that could be solved with the right knowledge and enough time. And she was aware, even as she felt it, that this pull was part of what people had always relied on to make her useful, and that she was letting herself be pulled anyway, because the problem was real, and the families were real, and the physic garden was there waiting, The terms of the arrangement were put in writing the following morning. In the Duke's study, which smelled of leather and old paper and iron, a room that had clearly been a working room for generations, with the accumulated evidence of work on every surface, the document was formal and careful and left no room for misinterpretation. Philippa was named as a ward of the estate, with specific rights and specific duties. The Duke signed it. She signed it. Galt witnessed it. She said, reading the fair copy before she signed, "The arrangement does not specify a duration." "No," the Duke said. "Is that deliberate?" He said, after a pause, "It is honest." She looked at him. He looked at the window, which was his habit when he had said something he did not intend to elaborate on. She signed the document. The first seed arrived the following week, in the form of a question so small she almost missed it. Nance was helping her sort the still-room inventory, dried herbs hanging in bundles, some still good, some years past, useful, and Philippa mentioned, without particular emphasis, that she had brought the document case down from the wardrobe shelf and put it on her writing table, because she kept meaning to go through her father's papers and kept finding other things to do instead. Nance stopped. Her hands, which had been tying a bundle of dried lavender, stopped mid-motion. Then she finished the knot, carefully, and said, "I shouldn't leave that too long. If I were you, papers have a way of mattering more than you expect." She moved to the next bundle. She did not look at Philippa while she said it. Philippa watched her. She said, "Did you know my father?" "I never had the pleasure," Nance said, which was true in its exact meaning, and possibly not in any other. Merton's first letter arrived on the 14th day. It was addressed to the Duke, and Philippa was not shown it directly. But she was in the hall when the post arrived, and she saw the handwriting on the outside, and she knew it. And she saw the Duke carry it into his study and close the door. He came out an hour later and said, without ceremony, "Merton is claiming the arrangement here invalidates your father's promise on grounds of impropriety. He has engaged a solicitor in London." Philippa looked at the study door. She said, "Does the arrangement give him grounds?" "No," the Duke said, "but he knows it will take time to demonstrate that. And time is useful to him." He looked at her for a moment, with the even assessment she was becoming accustomed to. "He will push until he finds the edge of what I will do. That is how he operates." She said, "You know how he operates." He said, "I have had occasion to study it." He did not say more. She did not ask. She carried that sentence with her to the physic garden, where the beds were overgrown, and the soil was cold and dark, and smelled of frozen earth and old roots, and the particular promise of things that have not died, only gone quiet. She began with the chamomile bed. The illness came in the second week of December, moving through the Wickstoke tenant cottages, the way illness moves in winter. First one, child, then three, then a whole lane of them, with a fever that broke on the second day, but left a cough that did not. A bark that woke parents at night and kept the older children from the fields. The hired surgeon from Harrogate came once, diagnosed a winter flux in general terms, prescribed rest, and sent a bill that represented a meaningful portion of the average family's monthly income. Philippa was in the physic garden the morning after the surgeon's visit, her hands in the frozen soil of the time bed. When Gerald found her and told her about it, he did it sideways. The way careful people deliver information, they have not been asked for mentioning that the Aldermere children were not improving, that the Stoke Lane family had 3 down now, that the surgeon had not left anything that appeared to be working. He did not ask for her help. He mentioned it in the vicinity of her and left her to decide. She went that afternoon. She went with a satchel of dried elderflower and mullein, and the compound she had put up the week before from the still room's remaining good stock. And she went to the Aldermere cottage first, because it was nearest, and she stayed 3 hours. And she showed the mother what to brew and how much and how often, and she listened to the youngest child's cough with her ear against the small chest, the way her mother had shown her. And she did not like the sound of it, but she knew it, and she knew what to give it, and she gave it. She went back the next day and the day after that. By the 4th day she had visited 9 cottages. By the 10th day the Aldermere youngest had turned the corner, and 2 of the Stoke Lane children had followed, and the mothers had begun to come to the still room door instead of waiting for her to come to them, which was the sign, her mother had told her, that the work was taking. The Duke came to the still room on a Thursday afternoon, when she was putting up a new batch of the cough compound. The room smelling of honey and dried herbs, and the steam from the small copper pot she had resurrected from the still room's back corner. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She heard him stop, and then he came in, and he did not say anything, and he looked at the bundles hanging from the ceiling, and the jars on the shelf she had relabeled in her own hand, and the mortar she was using, and he stayed for longer than an inspection of the room required. She said, not looking up, "The Aldermere child is recovering." "I know," he said. "I went this morning." He picked up one of the labelled jars and read it, turned it, set it down. "Galt told me you had been going every day. Someone needed to." He did not say anything to this. He was not the kind of man who said things to fill the space. She had stopped finding this unsettling around the 6th day and had begun to find it, if not comfortable, then at least honest. After a moment, he said, "Your mother taught you." "Her father was a physician," Philippa said. "She taught me to read his formularies when I was 11. She measured the honey into the pot by eye, which was the correct way to measure it once you knew what you were doing. She died when I was 15. I kept practicing," he said. "I am sorry." It was 2 words, and entirely without embellishment, and it was the most accurate expression of condolence she had heard in 2 months of people offering them. She said, "Thank you." They were quiet for a moment. The pot simmered. Outside the still-room window, the physic garden was frozen and bare, and looked the way things look in December when they are alive, but not showing it. He said, in the same tone, neither louder nor quieter, "Did your father ever have dealings with a man named Alderton?" Philippa looked at the pot. She said, "I do not know. Who is he?" "A banking agent," the Duke said. "He died some years ago. His estate was managed by a firm in York. A pause. There is a matter regarding some correspondence. I am trying to establish the chain of it," Philippa said. "I could look through my father's papers. If there is a name I recognize, I will tell you." She said it easily, because it was the natural offer to make, and because she had been meaning to go through the papers for 3 weeks and had not. He said, "There is no urgency." He said it the way a man says something he believes the opposite of, with the precise control of someone who has decided that urgency is not a productive posture, whenever it is convenient. He left the still room. She looked at the honey pot, at the way the steam rose from it, and she reached up with one hand and touched the cord at her neck, where the small brass key hung. And she thought about the sealed letter in the document case, the one addressed in a hand she did not know, to a name she could not place, and filed the thought away in the same part of her mind where she filed things she was not ready to open yet. That evening, alone in her sitting room, she took the document case from the writing table and set it on her lap. She turned the brass key in the lock and lifted the lid. The papers inside were organized the way her father had organized everything by date. oldest at the bottom. She went through them slowly from the top. The sealed letter was near the bottom, tucked between two older letters in her father's hand. It was sealed with plain wax, no device, and addressed in a different hand, formal and even, to a Mr. V. Alderton, care of a York banking firm. She held it for a long time. She turned it over. The seal was unbroken. She did not know a Mr. W. Alderton, and she did not know why her father had kept a letter addressed to him, and she did not know why his name had been the one the Duke had asked about that same afternoon. And she was aware that these three facts were probably not unrelated. She put the letter back. She locked the case. She sat with her hands on the lid for a moment and looked at the fire, which was burning low and steady, and asked no questions. She would open it in the morning. She told herself she needed to think first. The morning brought Merton. Not in person, not yet, but in the form of a rider who arrived at Ashborne Hall's front door at 9:30 with a legal document, which Galt received and brought to the Duke, who was in the breakfast room when it arrived. Philippa was there also, having come down early, and she saw the Duke's face when he read it, not the expression, which did not change, but the quality of the stillness in it, which became the kind of stillness that is not calm, but its controlled substitute. He handed her the document without comment. She read it. It was a legal claim, formally filed, asserting that the estate of her father owed Merton a settlement of £300 under the terms of the promise made in the sick room, a promise which, the document specified, Merton had engaged a London solicitor to record at the time, with a witness he named, and which he now considered legally binding. The document further stated that Philippa, as her father's heir, was the responsible party, and that Merton was prepared to consider the debt settled by other means, which was not specified but was not ambiguous. Philippa read it twice. She set it on the breakfast table. She said, "Is this valid?" "It is questionable," the Duke said. "A deathbed promise with a witness and a written record is not nothing." He looked at the document. "The solicitor he has used is competent. This has been prepared carefully. He has been planning this for some time." She said, "Yes," he said. He was looking at the document with an expression she was beginning to learn to read, not the iron surface of it, but the quality of attention underneath, which was the attention of a man who sees a problem he has seen before from a different angle. He will push this to the edge of what is legally defensible and stop just before that edge. He is experienced at it. She said, "You have dealt with him before." He said, "I know his methods." He picked up the document and folded it once. "I will have Fairbrother in Harrogate look at this. He is thorough. We will know within the week whether the claim has standing." He left the room. She sat for a moment with her tea, and the thought she had had the night before about the document case and the sealed letter and the name Alderton, and she thought I should have opened it last night. She went to the case after breakfast. She turned the key. She found the letter. She held it in her hands in the cold light of the sitting-room window, the paper thick and slightly yellowed at the edges, the seal still firm. She did not open it, not because she was afraid of it, but because something told her, some instinct she did not have words for yet, that when she opened it, things would change. And she was not yet certain she understood enough of the shape of what was already happening to know what kind of change she was opening the door to. She put it back. She locked the case. She went to the physic garden instead, because the time bed needed clearing, and the lavender had to be cut back before the hardest freeze came. And the garden was the place where she could think with her hands while her mind worked on something it was not quite ready to look at directly. Merton arrived in person on a Wednesday afternoon, at the end of the week, accompanied by a solicitor from London and the particular air of a man who has calculated that the time for letters is over. He asked to speak with the Duke. He was shown to the library. Philippa was not invited and did not go. She stayed in the still room and measured things, but she heard, later, from Galt, who heard it from the footman who brought the tea, that the conversation had been short and that Merton had done most of the speaking, and the Duke had said, at the end of it, something that the footman had not been close enough to hear clearly, but which had caused Merton to leave the library without waiting to be shown out. That evening the Duke came to the still room, which was unusual. He had visited twice before, but always in daylight, never in the evening, and he stood in the doorway while she finished the batch she was working on. And then he said, "He knows you are here, not as a ward. He knows you came to me at the assembly." She turned to look at him. His face was its usual careful surface. She said, "Someone told him. He has people in York," the Duke said, "as I have people watching him." He looked at the ceiling, at the hanging bundles. "He will use it if he can, to argue that the arrangement is improper." She said, "And is it?" He said, "No, but impropriety in this context is not a legal category. It is a social one." He looked at her. "It only has force if it is believed." She understood what he was not saying, that her reputation, which had already been made irregular by the circumstances of her departure from her father's house, was now further complicated by 6 weeks in a duke's establishment, and that Merton knew this and would use it as a crowbar if the legal claim was not sufficient. She did not say anything for a moment. The honey pot on the shelf smelled faintly of the last batch, and outside the still room the December evening was coming in cold and early the way December evenings did in Yorkshire. With absolute intention, she said, "What will you do?" He said, "I am working on it." He paused. "I would prefer to tell you when I have something certain to tell." She thought, that is the most honest answer available, and it is not enough. And he knows it is not enough, and he is telling me anyway. She said, "All right." The county gathering at Squire Hartley's house the following Thursday was the first public event Philippa had attended since arriving at Ashborne, and it was the first time she had seen Merton since the York Assembly. He was there with his London solicitor, and a woman Philippa did not recognize, and he moved through the room with the ease of a man who has decided the evening will go his way, which is a kind of ease that Philippa had learned, in her father's house, to treat as a weather warning. She stood near the fire with Galt's wife, who was a sensible woman named Hannah, who knew every family in Wickstoke and had opinions about the pheasant season, and she was discussing the cough compound with Hannah when she heard, from across the room, Merton's voice pitched slightly above the necessary volume for private conversation, saying to someone she could not see, "The arrangement is not quite what it presents itself as, I am afraid. The young woman has been at Ashborne Hall for 6 weeks with no proper female companion. One understands why Ashborne is generous with his hospitality, but generosity of that particular kind does tend to raise questions." The room did not go entirely quiet, but it went quieter. In the immediate vicinity, in the way rooms go quieter when someone has said something that requires everyone to decide simultaneously whether to react or to pretend they have not heard. The Duke was 4 paces away. Philippa knew this because she had been aware, without appearing to be, of where he was in the room since they arrived. He had been talking to Squire Hartley about a drainage survey. He stopped talking about the drainage survey, he said, from where he was standing, without raising his voice, without moving toward Merton. "She is under my protection." A pause. Exact and measured. That is all the explanation you will find here. Squire Hartley, who had known the Duke for 15 years, turned back to him and said something about the drainage survey. The Duke responded. The room reorganized itself around the fact that the conversation was over. Philippa looked at the fire. Her hands were steady. Her throat, however, was doing something that she recognized as the physical consequence of hearing someone say, in public and without hesitation, a thing she had not known she needed to hear, said, she was not going to cry at Squire Hartley's gathering. She looked at the fire instead, and she thought about the sealed letter in the document case, and she thought tomorrow Captain Rupert Thorne arrived on a Monday morning on a horse that had been ridden hard from the south, and Philippa knew who he was before anyone told her, because he had the Duke's height and the Duke's stillness, and absolutely none of the Duke's reserve. He walked into the entrance hall with a travelled coat and the air of someone returning to a place he loves but cannot live in. And he stopped when he saw Philippa and said, "Oh, you're real. Nance said you were real." "I was not entirely certain," Philippa said. "Were there other candidates?" He thought about it. He said, "A rumor and a hope. You seem better than both." He shook her hand the way men shake hands when they have decided to skip the formal register entirely. And he went to find his brother. She heard them for 2 hours behind the closed study door, which was how she knew the conversation was not about a military leave. When they came out, Rupert was carrying a leather satchel that he had not come in with, and the Duke was wearing the expression he wore when he had made a decision and was in the process of determining how to explain it to the relevant parties. The relevant parties, in this case, were Philippa and Gerald, who were called to the study after dinner. The fire was good. The room smelled of ink and leather and the cold that came off the windows in December, and the Duke stood at his desk and said, "Rupert has been investigating Merton's financial arrangements. He has found the source of the blackmail." Philippa's hands were folded in her lap. She said, "The blackmail. Merton has been extorting payments from this estate for 3 years," the Duke said, with the flatness of someone stating a fact they have had to live with long enough that the initial force of it has become something more like a managed weight. "He has a letter that he claims implicates my mother in a financial impropriety. The letter is a forgery. I have known it is a forgery for 3 years and have not been able to prove it." The room was very quiet. The fire settled. Philippa looked at the Duke, who was looking at the desk. She said, "What was the forger's name?" Rupert looked at her. Then he looked at his brother. He said, "Alderton." The word landed in the room and did not move. Philippa reached up and touched the cord at her neck. It was not a conscious movement. She felt the Duke's attention shift to her hand, and she lowered it. And she said, slowly, "My father's papers." She said it to herself as much as to either of them. "There is a sealed letter in my document case. It is addressed to a Mr. W. Alderton, care of a York banking firm. I have never opened it. I do not know the hand." Rupert said, "Where is the case?" She was already standing. She went upstairs, and she brought the case down, and she set it on the Duke's desk, and she took the cord from around her neck and put the brass key in the lock and turned it. The lid opened. She found the letter near the bottom of the stack, between 2 letters in her father's hand. Exactly where it had been for 2 months and 3 weeks. She held it for a moment. She looked at the Duke, who was standing on the other side of the desk and had gone very still, not the controlled stillness she was used to, but a different kind, the kind that happens before something that cannot be undone. She said, "You should be here when I open it." "Yes," he said. She broke the seal. The paper inside was folded twice. closely written in a formal clerk's hand, and it took her only the first paragraph to understand what she was reading. She read it through to the end. Then she set it on the desk and turned it toward the Duke and stepped back one pace so he had room to reach it. He read it. Rupert read it over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke while they were reading. The letter was from a banking agent named William Alderton to her father, dated 8 years prior. It described, in the careful language of a man writing something he knows may be needed in evidence later, the following: that Alderton had been instructed by the father of Gerald Fenwick, Viscount Merton, to draft a letter on the stationery of the Duchess of Ashborne, the current Duke's mother, implicating her in a financial arrangement that did not exist, that Alderton had done so, under duress, having been threatened with the exposure of a separate debt, that Alderton had kept a copy of the draft in his own hand, as insurance, that the original letter used in the blackmail was therefore a forgery authored by Alderton himself, not the Duchess, and that Alderton was prepared to testify to this fact if required. The draft, in Alderton's hand, was enclosed. Alderton was writing to her father because her father had, at some point, learned enough of the situation to ask the right questions, and Alderton had trusted him with the answer. Her father had kept it. He had sealed it and kept it among his papers, and had died before he could act on it. And Philippa had carried it north in a locked case and put it on a shelf, and not opened it for 67 days. The Duke set the letter down. He put both hands flat on the desk, on either side of it, and looked at it with the expression of a man who has been walking in the dark for 3 years and has just found not a door but a window and realized the window has been open the whole time. He said, "You have been carrying this for 2 months." Philippa said, "I did not know what it was." "No," he said. He looked up at her. His face had the particular quality of a man who has just had to revise not a single fact, but an entire structure. "You could not have known," Rupert said, from beside his brother. Phil, which was what he had called her. "Already. Since the morning. I need to take this to York tomorrow, to the county magistrate. If I file before Merton knows we have it, he cannot destroy it." Philippa said, "It will be enough." Rupert looked at the draft in Alderton's hand. He said, "It will be more than enough." He looked at his brother. "If we file tomorrow," the Duke said, "go tonight." He said it without deliberation. The decision had been made before the sentence began. "Take the groom and the fast horse. File first thing in the morning." Rupert nodded. He looked at Philippa. He said, "The letter came from your father's trust in you." He said it plainly, without decoration, the way honest things are said when the speaker is not trying to make them land as anything other than what they are. He kept it because he meant to use it. He gave it to you because you were the right person to carry it. Philippa said, "He did not tell me he was giving it to me." "No," Rupert said, "but you kept it anyway." He left to prepare for the ride. The study was quieter without him. The fire burned. The letter lay on the desk with its enclosed draft. 2 pieces of paper that had been in her possession for 67 days and had not, in all that time, been anything except paper. She looked at the Duke. He was looking at the desk, at the letter. His left hand was still on the surface of it, next to the document, but not touching it, and she could see from 2 paces away that his hand was not entirely steady, which was the first time she had seen anything in him that was not. She said, "Are you all right?" He said, after a moment, "I have not said her name to anyone in 3 years." His voice was level. It was the levelness of considerable effort. In an formal context, I have avoided it. She understood what he meant, that using his mother's name in any proceeding connected to the scandal, even to clear it, had felt, for 3 years, like touching the thing that had been used to harm her. and that he had protected her by silence, the way you protect a wound by keeping it covered, even when keeping it covered was preventing it from healing. She said, "You will have to say it now." "Yes," he said. "She did not say it will be all right. She did not say she would want you to. She said nothing, because nothing was the accurate response, and she had learned this from him." He looked at the letter one more time. Then he straightened. He said, "In the morning, we will need to determine the jurisdictional question. Merton has filed his counterclaim in London, which creates a conflict with a York filing." He looked at her. The steadiness was back, or something that wore its face. "It may not be simple," she said. "It rarely is." She paused. "But it is not complicated either, if you have the right documents." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in the iron surface of his face, not a change in expression, precisely, but a change in what was underneath the expression. The way the weather under still water is different from still water above it. He said, "No." He picked up the letter and the enclosed draft and placed them in the leather satchel on his desk. "It is not complicated." He did not say anything else, but when she left the study, she heard him, behind her, say something quiet to himself in the room. Not words she could make out, just the shape of them, soft and private, the shape of a name said alone, which is a different thing from the shape of a name said in public and costs something entirely different to say. Rupert reached York before dawn and filed the documents with the county magistrate's office at 8:30 in the morning. As soon as the office opened, he sent a rider back to Ashborne Hall at 9 with a note that said filed, stamped, copied, witnessed. The original letter and the Alderton draft are in the magistrate's custody. The rider arrived at noon. Philippa was in the physic garden when Galt brought her the note, and she read it, standing in the frozen mud between the chamomile bed and the rosemary hedge, with her gloves still on, and she felt something she did not name loosen in her chest. The complication arrived at 2 in the afternoon in the form of a second rider, this one from Rupert in York, who had gone from the magistrate's office directly to the York correspondent of Merton's London solicitor. "The note," said Merton, "filed a counterclaim in London 3 days ago before we knew about the letter, naming a jurisdictional conflict that requires the Duke to appear in person in York to certify the estate's standing in the letter proceeding. Without his personal appearance, the filing is technically incomplete and can be challenged. The problem was this: Merton had also, on the same day he filed in London, reserved the legal claim on Philippa's father's estate, the £300 settlement claim, through the county magistrate in Harrogate rather than York, which put it in a different jurisdiction from the Alderton filing and meant it could not be resolved at the same hearing. If the Duke went to York, Philippa's Harrogate claim went undefended. If he stayed in Harrogate, the York filing was incomplete. Philippa brought Rupert's note to the study. The Duke read it. Galt read it. The three of them stood around the desk in the December afternoon light and looked at the shape of what Merton had done, which was not clever, exactly, but was experienced the move of a man who has run this kind of calculation before and knows where the seams in a legal proceeding tend to be. The Duke said, "He knew we would file. He knew you would find the letter eventually." Galt said, "He has been trying to find it himself for 2 years. He did not know where it was." Philippa said, "He did not know I had it." "No," the Duke said. He looked at the window. He knew Alderton had written it. He did not know where it ended up. He turned from the window. His face had the particular quality of a man who has found the mistake in a calculation he has been running for a long time and is not pleased about it. Not because it changes the answer, but because he wishes he had found it sooner. He assumed it was in the estate's papers. She said, He was looking for something in my father's estate. The Duke said, Yes, a pausa. The settlement claim was not only about the money. He needed access to your father's papers to find and destroy the letter before we could use it. The room was quiet. The fire burned. Philippa looked at the document case, which was on the corner of the Duke's desk where she had left it the night before, and thought about Merton at the York Assembly, crossing the room toward her with the calm of a man collecting an object he has already paid for, and she thought, not her, the case. He was crossing the room toward the case. She said, He came to the Assembly specifically to find me, to get the case. I believe so, the Duke said, and I ran from him, she said, and grabbed your arm. Yes, the Duke said. The silence that followed had something in it that neither of them addressed directly, which was the shape of a thing neither of them had language for yet, but which was present in the room, the way cold is present in a room before anyone names it. God said, carefully, so the question is York or Harrogate? Not York or Harrogate, the Duke said. He had already decided. She could hear it in the evenness of the sentence. York. We go to York. The Harrogate claim will be defended on grounds that the settlement claim was filed in bad faith as a diversionary measure, which it was, and Fairbrother can establish that in the documentation. He looked at Philippa. You will need to be in York as well. You are the primary witness for the letter's chain of custody. She said, When? Tomorrow, he said. They left for York before light, arriving at the magistrate's office at 9:30 in the morning, and the proceeding was held in a room that smelled of ink, cold stone, and the very specific wariness of a space where difficult things are regularly decided. Rupert was there, Fairbrother. The Harrogate solicitor was there with his documents. The magistrate was a man of 60, with the expression of someone who has seen most categories of human difficulty and retains the capacity for surprise. Only about 2 or 3 of them. The magistrate's clerk took statements. Rupert's first, then Fairbrother's on the Harrogate filing. Then the Duke was asked to provide a formal statement certifying the estate's standing and establishing the provenance of the complaint against Merton. He dictated it aloud, slowly, while the clerk wrote it down. She was standing at the window. There was one window, looking out onto a narrow street, and she had gone to stand at it because the room was small, and she did not want to be in his direct line of sight while he was doing this. She was looking at the street, at a cart going past with a load of winter turnips, at a woman in a grey cloak walking fast against the cold. She heard him say, in the formal cadence of a man dictating for a legal record, the following: that the letter in the magistrate's custody had been in the possession of the late Mr. James Crale of Derbyshire, who had received it from William Alderton for safekeeping, that the letter established by the enclosed draft in Alderton's own hand, that the document used in a 3-year blackmail of the Ashborne estate was a forgery, that the forgery had been committed on behalf of Gerald Fenwick, Viscount Merton, using the stationery of the Duchess of Ashborne, his late mother, without her knowledge or consent. He said her name. He said it as part of a legal sentence, in the flat, formal cadence of testimony, and it was 4 words. The Duchess of Ashborne. And he said it without stopping, without the hesitation she had half expected, because he had decided to say it, and when he decided things, he said them. But she was looking at the window and not at him, and she heard the exact quality of those 4 words, the particular sound of a name said in public that has been kept private for 3 years, and she understood without looking what it cost him. The clerk's pen continued. The turnip cart had gone. The woman in the grey cloak had turned a corner and was gone. He finished the statement. The clerk read it back. He said, That is correct. The clerk stamped it. Rupert was looking at his brother. He was not saying anything, which was the most serious Philippa had seen him. He put his hand briefly on his brother's shoulder, one hand. One moment. Neither of them speaking. And then he moved away to speak to Fairbrother. And the Duke turned toward the window. And Philippa was at the window. And they were standing 2 paces apart, in the cold light of the magistrate's office, looking at the same narrow street. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. After a moment he exhaled a breath that had been held at some depth, coming up slowly, and his hands, which she could see at his sides, unclenched, and the morning outside the window continued to be exactly what it was. Merton arrived at the York magistrate's office at 11 in the morning, with his London solicitor and the expression of a man who has already calculated the outcome of the day and found it acceptable, which is the most dangerous expression a person in a legal proceeding can wear. He greeted the Duke with the formal courtesy of a man who is performing civility in front of a magistrate, and he greeted Philippa with a glance that assessed, in 2 seconds, whether the case was with her. It was not. She had given it to the clerk on arrival. The hearing proceeded. Merton's solicitor challenged the provenance of the Alderton letter, the same challenge Philippa had anticipated in the still room 3 weeks ago, when she thought about the question of what it would take to prove the chain of custody. Fairbrother produced the banking firm's own records, obtained through the York correspondent who had been, it emerged, quietly cooperative since Rupert first approached him in November, showing Alderton's employment dates, his handwriting on file documents, and the date the draft was written. The handwriting matched the enclosed draft exactly. Philippa was called. She stood at the small table the magistrate used for witnesses, and she explained, in the straightforward terms of a woman who has no reason to be anything except accurate, how the document case had come to her, what she knew of its contents, why she had not opened the sealed letter until the night before last, and what she found when she did. Merton's solicitor asked, how could she be certain the letter had not been opened and resealed? She said she could not be entirely certain, but the seal had shown no evidence of having been disturbed, and she had carried the case locked since receiving it, and the key had not left her person in that time. She reached into the collar of her dress and produced the cord and the brass key. She held it up. She said, if the seal was disturbed, it was not disturbed by me, and it was not disturbed during the time I held it. The solicitor tried 2 more approaches. Fairbrother answered both of them with the patience of a man who has already done the reading and finds the questions less interesting than the answers. Merton sat at the far side of the room. He did not speak, because his solicitor was speaking, which was the arrangement. But at a certain point, when the magistrate had both documents in front of him and had been reading them for 2 minutes with the focused attention of a man who has found the thing that makes the case simple, Merton's posture changed. It was not dramatic. His shoulders dropped perhaps half an inch, and his jaw released a fraction. And he looked at his solicitor and then looked at the magistrate and then looked at the table in front of him. She watched him from across the room. She thought about what he had said to her at the York Assembly, when he had finally gotten close enough to speak that she needed to stop making things difficult, that this was a matter of fulfilling what her father had agreed to, that she was not considering his situation. She thought about the woman he was. In his way, the man who had looked at her father's promise and seen a solution to a problem he did not know how to solve any other way. He was not a villain constructed for the purpose. He was a man who had decided that other people's resources were available to him because his need was urgent, and who had been right about that for long enough that he had stopped asking whether it was true. The solicitor withdrew the counterclaim. He did it quietly, in the formal language of a man managing a retreat, and he did it while the magistrate was still reading, which meant, It did not require the magistrate to issue a ruling on it. It simply ceased to be a matter before the court. The claim on Philippa's father's estate, which Fairbrother then addressed in 3 careful sentences, was struck on grounds that it had been filed in bad faith as a diversionary measure, which the pattern of concurrent filings in different jurisdictions established clearly enough that the magistrate nodded twice while Fairbrother was speaking and did not need to be persuaded. Merton gathered his papers. He stood. His solicitor spoke to the clerk. Merton looked, once, at Philippa, and she looked back at him, and he said quietly, "Not for the room. Just for her you think I wanted you." He said it flatly, without heat. "I wanted what your father promised me." She said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment. Something passed across his face that was not quite shame and not quite its absence. Then he walked out, and his solicitor followed him, and the door of the magistrate's office closed on both of them. The magistrate finished reading. He stamped 3 documents. He said, "To the room in general. The matter of the estate of Ashborne contra Fenwick is resolved in favor of the estate." He looked at Philippa. "The ward of Ashborne Hall may consider the claim against her father's estate discharged." Rupert said, under his breath, "Good." They returned to Ashborne Hall in the late afternoon, arriving as the early dark came down over the moors, and the house appeared in the elms with its lights already lit. Looking like what? It was a house where someone had anticipated their arrival and prepared for it, which is a thing houses do when they are genuinely lived in. Philippa went to the still room. This was not a decision so much as a direction. The way water goes downhill, she went, because it was where she went when she needed to have her hands doing something while the rest of her processed what had happened. She lit the lamp and the small fire under the grate and began taking stock of what needed to be put up before the worst of the winter came, and she was halfway through the inventory when she heard his footsteps in the passage. He came in. He was still in his traveling coat, which he had not changed, and his hair was still carrying the cold of the journey. And he stood in the doorway for a moment, and then came in and set something on the work table beside her, the brass key, on its cord. She had left it on the Duke's desk in York after the hearing. Without thinking about it, she had simply set it down when the clerk was done with it, and had not picked it up again. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said, "You left this." She said, "I know. I forgot." He said, "I don't think you forgot." She looked at the key and thought that was probably accurate. She said, "I suppose I was finished with it." "No," he said, and the word was very quiet and very certain. "You are not finished with it." He looked at the work table, at the herbs and the jars, and the order she had made out of what had been chaos when she arrived. He said, "I want to say something. I have been trying to work out how to say it since the hearing." She waited. He said, "I told myself, when you first arrived, that the arrangement was practical," which it was. He picked up one of the jars on the work table, looked at it, set it down. He did not raise his voice, because he never raised his voice. "I told myself you were useful to the estate, which you are." He looked at her. "I told myself I would not think beyond those 2 things." She said, "Did it work?" He said, "No." She looked at the lamp. The flame was steady. Outside the still room, the house was warm and quiet, and somewhere in it, Rupert was probably eating something from the kitchen, and Nance was probably supervising him with the resigned patience of someone who has managed military men in their off-duty hours before. She said, "What did you think instead?" He said, "That I have been doing this alone for 3 years. He stopped. He said, "Not the estate. I can manage the estate. I mean..." He stopped again. He was not a man who ran out of words often, and when he did, the absence of them was very visible. In the York Assembly, when you grabbed my arm, I was in the middle of a conversation about road surveys. She said, I remember. I noticed you before you grabbed my arm. He said, I had seen you standing near the wall. I was aware. He stopped. He said, more carefully, I was aware of you in the way you are aware of something that is in the wrong place for no good reason, and I was trying to determine what the wrong place was. And then you grabbed my arm, and I understood. She said, understood what? He said, that you were not in the wrong place. You were in the precise right place, for a reason I was not yet in a position to see. He looked at the work table, and then at the door, and then at her, and he said, with the specific difficulty of a man who has very few words for the things that matter most to him, you have been in precisely the right place for every single moment since then, including the moments I did not know I needed you in. The still room was quiet. The fire under the grate made its small sounds. She said, that is almost a contract. He said, I know. She said, you could try something that is less almost. He said, after a pause, I don't want you to stay because it is useful. He said it the way a man says the thing he has been trying not to say. Simply, and without decoration. I want you to stay. Because he stopped. Because when Rupert asked me, on the road back from York, what I was going to say to you, I could not stop talking, and I talked to very few people. She said, what did you say to him? That you went to 9 cottages. He said, in December, without being asked, and that you came to the magistrate's office and held up a key in front of a room full of people and said it did not leave my person, and that I have not been able to find the correct framing for. He stopped. He looked at her. I do not know how to say the thing I am trying to say, except as a list of facts that point at it from the sides. Philippa looked at him. She thought about pointing at things from the sides, which was something she did, also arriving at the important thing by going around it, through the physic garden and the inventory and the frozen chamomile bed, and ending up at the center without having approached it directly. She said, your list of facts is sufficient. He said, is it? She said, it is better than sufficient. It is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in 2 months. She looked at the cord and the key on the work table. She picked up the key, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she put it back around her neck where it belonged. She said, stay in the still room for a while. I am not finished with the inventory. He looked at the second stool in the corner, the one that had appeared there in the 2nd week of December without either of them having arranged it. He sat down. He did not say anything. She returned to the inventory, and he watched her work, and the fire burned low and steady, and the evening outside was Yorkshire in December, cold, dark, and entirely itself, and it lasted until the candle burned half down, and at some point, in the middle of it, without either of them marking the moment, it became something else. January, and the physic garden under frost. The beds white at the edges and dark at the center, where the cold had not yet reached the roots. 2 pairs of boot prints in the mud from the kitchen gate to the far hedge and back one set heavier, longer strided, returning from the south pastures. One set lighter, stopping twice at the rosemary hedge, which needed attention. The still room fire was already lit when they both came in from outside, because Nance had started it without being asked, the way she had been starting it since November. Because she was very good at her job, and because she had been waiting for this particular morning for 3 years and intended it to be warm. A formulary open on the work table, her hand and his hand in the margins, her notes in the careful script she used for remedies, his in the compressed hand he used for everything. One sentence he had written the evening before about the lavender propagation she had asked about, which was not his area of knowledge but which he had looked up anyway because she had asked. Outside the window the sky was pale and honest, and doing nothing to make itself more than what it was, which was enough. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue, not a woman made smaller so a man could be larger. Something more ordinary than any of those, and more durable to people who had each been carrying something too heavy to carry alone, who had found each other at exactly the moment the weight required two pairs of hands and who had stayed, not because it was useful, but because staying, by then, was simply true. She grabbed a stranger's arm with no plan and no certainty and no particular reason to trust him except that the room moved for him and she was out of time. And what she did not know, what neither of them knew, was that she had been carrying the answer to his worst problem for 67 days in a case she had never opened, not because she was protecting him, because she had not yet found the right moment. And then the right moment found her. If this story stayed with you, press like and share it with someone who needs a heroine, who wins by going to 9 cottages in December and holding up a key in a magistrate's office and staying in the still room until the candle burns half down. Subscribe and ring the bell so the next story reaches you. One question worth arguing about when Philippa opened that document case in front of the Duke. She could have read the letter privately first. She opened it with him there, not knowing what was inside. Was that trust, or was it simply the most honest thing available to a woman who had spent her whole life being told her choices were not her own to make, finally making one,